Thank you, Chairs. Yes, I'm going to try and address the question posed, nutritional support of critically ill patients at admission, enteral or parenteral. And I think probably the last word on this at the moment is this important systematic review and meta-analysis in critical care that was published recently by Gunnar Elke in Darren Hyland's group, putting together the trials in this area. The thing that shocked me when I read this article was they did a very careful selection of the 18 RCTs, relevant ones, 3,347 patients, but then noticing that at the bottom there, the trial that was done by our group actually makes up about 70% of the available evidence, which probably makes me think that critiquing our study is probably going to be quite an important thing to do in answering this question. Ours was a phase 3, and I think the important thing about our study was that it was a pragmatic study. It was very much what was the best route for delivery of early nutritional support in the real world. When we were doing it, there were 3 meta-analyses, but they gave conflicting evidence regarding the optimal route. And also there was concern about malnutrition in NHS hospitals. There's a lot of concern in NHS hospitals. Malnutrition is just one of them. And it did suggest from Simpson and Doig that could be anything up to about a 49% benefit for parenteral nutrition. We updated the meta-analysis at that point we were doing the trial, and you could see that the overall sort of odds ratio relative risk was about 0.82, so suggesting an 18% mortality benefit. We powered our study with a relative risk reduction of 20%, so around that 18%. Interestingly, we were told that we might be underpowered, which surprises me how all those other studies with less than 100 patients could possibly be powered. In terms of sites, it was very much usual critical care units in the UK using their usual established protocols. They were actually having bundles of care for bloodstream infection, preventing VAP, preventing thromboembolic events, and they were all doing not tight glycemic control, but glycemic control in accordance with international guidelines. There were 33 units that took part, geographically spread. Sorry about that's England, in case that's not a familiar graph. I think more importantly, I haven't got a pointer, I don't know whether I can show you here, we really tried to make the units in the hospitals in calories reflective of the non-university hospitals that mainly provide critical care in the UK, trying to make it as pragmatic as possible. Adult general patients, unplanned admissions, expected to receive nutritional support for 2 or more days and not planned for discharge within 3 days. Our exclusion criteria were really those mainly about not being able to deliver one or either of the routes as early nutritional support. We had 36 hours. We wanted to do 24 hours for early, but we felt that to get the patient admitted, the eligibility criteria met, informed consent, randomized, and start the nutritional support, we used a 36-hour time window. And patients were randomly allocated for 5 days of normal nutritional support in that unit, a target of 25 kilocalories per kilogram per day, followed for 5 days unless the patient transitioned to either total oral feeding, was discharged, or died. People used local feeding protocols, standard feeds, they were allowed to add micronutrients, they aimed for a target, and they were allowed to adjust for obese patients or volume as required. We randomized 2,400 patients, 1,200 into each group. We lost a few for issues of withdrawal or people withdrawing, lost a follow-up, and ended up with about just under 1,200 in each group. Patients were balanced at baseline on case mix, on severe comorbidities, on surgical status and mechanical ventilation, on acute severity of illness measured in every way that we could measure it, including the SOFA score, on nutritional status. And again, I think it's worth pointing out that actually there was only a small proportion of patients who had a high degree of malnutrition in the study, representing the kind of patients that we get into our sort of general units. And both were started early in terms of 24 hours within 24 or 22 hours. We did have a little bit of non-adherence, but this mainly was in the parenteral nutrition arm, it looked like it was quite high at 6.8%. But when we investigated it in detail, it was actually shifting from parenteral nutrition to enteral nutrition at the end of the 5 days. It was really stopping a bit early rather than actually a kind of, not providing the full 5 days. In terms of nutritional support, the mean daily calories, this was very surprising to our clinicians. They didn't manage to hit target when we added up all the various caloric intake from all the various sources. And then if you look at it over the 5 days, what we actually did was a trial of, if you like, of underfeeding in both arms if you consider 25 kilocalories per kilogram per day. As you can see, even in the adjusted for patient part days and patient death, only about 30 to 40% were meeting target. What was the outcome? I'm sure you're aware. We found no difference in 30-day mortality, and that stayed the same when we adjusted for those problems with a little bit of non-adherence. Secondary outcomes, all-cause mortality, again, no difference, adjusted or unadjusted. No difference in survival out to 90 days. No difference in infectious complications overall, either laboratory confirmed or strongly suspected. And no difference within those who got the infectious complications in the type of infections or the sites of those infections that the patients got. We found no differences in critical care stay or acute hospital stay, and there were no differences in serious adverse events. So really, we couldn't split them. One of the only ways we did split the two groups was, in fact, in terms of the costs. And you can see here, one thing you can see here, that the dominant costs are not actually the feed. The dominant costs are the costs of the critical care stay and the general medical ward stay, and that these are the costs up to 1 year, and personal and community care. As you can see, they dwarf the actual intervention and any other nutritional feeds provided by the patient. We followed patients up to 1 year for their quality of life. I'll just put the global result here, but you can actually see that parenteral nutrition was actually associated with a higher mean cost, but also with a higher mean quality adjusted life year. Not sufficient in terms of, it wasn't less than £20,000 per quality adjusted life year, so not something that our NICE, our National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, would adopt, but it did suggest that there was maybe some estimates of quality of life improvement with parenteral nutrition. Why have I shown you that? Well, coming back to this meta-analysis, I think it's quite important to see that sort of just how much 2,400 patients dominates the 3,347 patients in this meta-analysis. That said, one trial shouldn't dictate all. When we combine, Highland's group, I think fairly non-equivocally show that the overall mortality, using the mix of different primary outcomes from the trials, there is no difference in mortality by route. Looking at infectious complications, when they combine the studies, despite our study and the large sample size and no difference, they show that actually enteral nutrition, that infectious complications are more with using the parenteral route, parenteral nutrition. They show that ICU length of stay is significantly affected when you combine that, and it favours the enteral route, but no differences in hospital length of stay or mechanical ventilation. They then did this, I think, quite important a priori subgroup analysis, where they actually looked at the trials, and it was something that we were trying to tackle, and were luckily, because our clinicians underfed in both groups, we didn't have that dose difference in nutrition in the two arms. We almost luckily ended up with the same dose in both arms. A lot of trials of PN and EN, actually you end up with a dose difference because parenteral nutrition will provide usually the dose that you prescribe, whereas enteral nutrition, with the complications surrounding it, often the dose is lower. So they actually put a subgroup analysis into this systematic review and meta-analysis that said they would split the trials by whether the PN and EN showed a dose difference or a caloric difference in the two arms, or actually they were the same. So here you can see here that for the trials that they determined that the caloric intake for parenteral nutrition was greater than that for the enteral nutrition, there's no difference in mortality here. And similarly, for the trials where the parenteral nutrition or the parenteral route, the caloric intake was not significantly different in the two arms of the randomized control trials, that's where they put those trials in, you can see no difference in mortality. So for mortality, it would seem that that doesn't bear out. When you come to infectious complications, I think this is where they begin to split. And I'm not a clinician, so you guys are better at interpreting this than me. But in those trials where the caloric intake by parenteral or enteral route was similar, there seemed to be no difference in infectious complications in the overall meta-analysis. But in those where parenteral nutrition was at a higher caloric intake, relative to those randomized to the enteral route, you can see that's where the result showing that parenteral route is associated with more infection complications sort of plays out. And you can see also in these caloric intake not reported, the Chen trial there seems to sit with the PN greater than EN caloric intake group. And I want to just show you this, which is also in their systematic review. And I don't know how many of you understand these funnel plots for looking for publication bias. But if a trial has a small standard error, it's a big trial, okay? And if a trial has a big standard error, it's a small trial. And what this analysis does is it says, I should see, this is for infectious complications, I should see as many trials on either side of my pyramid when I plot the standard error against the risk ratio found in the trial. And what you see here is a larger number of these smaller trials, ones with large standard errors, but no equivalent trials. And what this often represents is what you call publication bias. If you do a small trial, your endpoint's infectious complications, you find no difference, you never get it published for whatever reason. Maybe you try to, but it's no difference and no one's interested, or you don't try to because you haven't got a big result to tell. And there is this problem, potentially, that actually the differences that we're seeing in infectious complications is because there's a missing population of these small trials that may have been done that show no difference in infectious complications, but actually didn't make it into what we would call the sort of substantive literature. Whereas you've got a greater sort of, if you like, distribution in the few larger trials. I mean, there's only one very large trial being done, like I showed you. And this significant result for asymmetry gives you an indication that publication bias is operating. So I agree, in fact, with the authors of this group in terms of their if you like, key messages. I think the updated meta-analysis comparing EN with PN does show shows no significant difference in mortality, so we're not looking at a survival benefit. It does appear that on the data that you can find, that EN is associated with a significant reduction in infectious complications and also in ICU length of stay. And this may be something to do with caloric intake. We saw the results change by those splitting the trials by the differences in the groups by caloric intake, but probably more likely, and it happens in many other clinical areas and many other areas of evidence base, that there's probably a significant publication bias going on in terms of the small trials that might have been done that showed no difference in infectious complications but didn't go on to subsequent publication. But that's a hypothesis. We would need to go and do a search of the grey literature. So in conclusion, I think from the available literature, the EN still should be considered the first-line nutritional therapy over PN in critically ill patients with a functioning gastrointestinal tract. And I think we're now moving on to the many other important questions that we still need to know the answer to in terms of sort of dose, etc. Thank you very much.